How is intelligence affected by our faith? How does the mind work differently if you believe or don't believe? So we take a look, for example, at the difference in the way a physicist approaches nature, creation, existence, and the way a person who believes in God approaches physics or nature. Now, the very obvious difference, one of the obvious differences, is that if you believe in God, you have different questions and different observations about nature. Where if you don't believe in God, you wouldn't have those observations, you wouldn't have that information. For example, we all know that we have freedom of choice. We don't live by reflex and by impulse and by instinct. We make choices. We are thoughtful creatures. And we can choose what we want to do. Now, a scientist would come along and say, what exactly is this freedom of choice that you have? What does it consist of? And how did you get it? How did this come about? But the scientist is not going to ask, why do we have freedom of choice? Can't ask that question. If you believe in God, and you believe that God created the world with a plan and with a purpose, you're also going to ask, what exactly is freedom of choice? How did we get freedom of choice? But then you're going to ask the additional question, why? Why do we have freedom of choice? And the answer is going to be, because God wants a relationship with us, and if we don't have freedom of choice, it's not much of a relationship if we're programmed. Then God is talking to himself. So in order for God to be able to talk to us and have a relationship with us, we have to have freedom of choice. So here's a very clear difference between the way a believer examines and explores nature and a non-believer examines and explores nature. There's a very fundamental difference. The fundamental difference is, where do you begin? If you're going to examine the world, nature, if you're going to study it, where are you beginning? Are you working from the fact of physical existence, the fact that there is a world, and try to work your way back to where it came from and how and so on? Or are you starting from the beginning and following the progression from creator to creation? It's a completely different view of the world. It's a completely different way of thinking. Let's explore that a little bit. The physicist looks at a piece of wood and he says, what is this? Of course, it's a piece of wood. What is it really? Upon closer examination, what is it? A bunch of molecules. On closer examination, it's atoms. On closer examination, it's subatomic particles. And on closer examination, it disappears. It's gone. It's gone. It's nothing. It's an energy. It's a behavior pattern, or whatever physicists call the physical stuff. So what's happening? He starts off with the fact that there is a piece of wood. He can't question that. That's the assumption. That's the beginning. That's the start. This exists. This is here. Now, what is it? So he's beginning with something that he takes for granted. It's an axiom. We have existence. Now we got to find out more about it. But interestingly, as we find out more about the existence of a physical thing, it starts to exist less and less. Suddenly, under the microscope, it's not what it looks like, it's not what it feels like, it's not what it tastes like, it's a whole different thing. And the deeper we look, the closer we get to what this thing really is, the more it disappears on us. It stops being. So we start off with the assumption that this really is, and as we explore further and further, it becomes less and less existent until we have to wonder, how does it exist at all? Because it's all made out of electrons, and the electrons are all in motion, and there doesn't seem to be any restraints on this motion. The electrons are flying off of this thing constantly. how does it even stay in existence? So the physicist works from what is to what isn't. And in the end, he ends up in a very murky, mysterious, intangible reality that he doesn't know what to make of. Person who believes in God starts the other way around. If you believe that God created the world, then your basic assumption, your primary assumption is that there is nothing besides God. And what is God? God has no definition. God has no properties. He is not governed by any kind of law or rule or limit of any kind at all. What does that mean? The most basic rule of all things is that everything is governed by being and non-being. Either something is or it's not. It's got to be one of the two. It either is or it isn't. It exists or it doesn't exist. It's one of the two. In fact, it did not exist, and then it did exist. So it went from one to the other. But it always has to be one or the other. What do we say about God? Okay, God has no limits. He's not 6 feet tall. He's not very old. He has no limits of time, of space. But does God have that limit that everything else has? He either exists or he doesn't exist. No. God doesn't have that kind of restriction on him either. So you say, well, God exists. No, he doesn't. Oh, you mean he doesn't exist? Well, of course he does. So does he or doesn't he? This is not how you measure God. Does she or doesn't she? That's a different question. And you don't ask that about God, because he has no hairdresser. So can you say God does exist? No. Well, then he doesn't exist. No, that's not true either. God. He's God. And before God created, there was no existence or non-existence. That's only true of created things.